Hi, Jeremy here, Modern Vitality. In today's video, we're going to explore a concept that is so counterintuitive it's not even funny, but a growth mindset, right? That's usually a good thing. We want to move from point A to point B. We want to feel better. We want to get our symptoms down, right? We don't want to stay where we are. It's necessary to have a growth mindset. And this is what all successful people focus on. Success in any field, right? So we're looking at healing specifically, but success in achieving your goals can be studied across anywhere, and you can reverse engineer the principles people are using to make great success in business, in relationships, right? Whatever it is, and we can start to apply it to our own health and healing too. When we start to look at systems thinking, this starts to change everything. So one of my jobs is to point out little contradictions, little things that get stuck in our subconscious where we think, for example, like a growth mindset, that's a good thing, that'll help me get better faster, right? But I'm here to point out there's actually a deep paradox here, and there's a serious downside to having a growth mindset. And in fact, the paradox is it can help keep you stuck exactly where you are if you're not aware of how this works. So in today's video, we're going to break down some deep psychology so you can learn about yourself at another level and hopefully make some subconscious transformations so that you can become the person who will arrive at the future you're trying to create. This is how we do it. So let's get started. So today's a walk and talk video. And usually in these, I like to do frequently asked questions, right? Things we get from our group or the same kinds of questions that I've seen coming up again and again and again within just my career of working with people with complex chronic health conditions, right? There are some common threads. There are some kind of popular misunderstandings. There are things that need to be cleared up. And one of the ways that I can suss out and figure out where we need to start is by paying attention to the questions, right? So today's video, today's walk and talk is kind of like a meta walk and talk. This is a mega walk and talk where I'm going over the question behind the question, right? So all the questions people have, a lot of them come down to this. And if you don't understand this, you're going to get stuck in the land of questions. So I know I'm being very grandiose and very vague, but I promise you, if you watch this through and then rewatch the introduction, it'll make perfect sense, right? I'm taking you on a circle of learning here. So one of the things about a growth mindset that's really great is that the kind of person who's fueled by that or who can cultivate that usually has now the capacity to achieve their goal, to achieve great things. The growth mindset's required so you can come out of your comfort zone, right? Now it's really important because the area of growth is the uncertainty, right? It's the area between your comfort zone and something new, right? So there's a lot of uncertainty there, and sometimes there can be fear and all that. And having a growth mindset will help you push through that fear, right? It'll help you unblock some of that, which is good. Now here's the paradox. And I had to figure this out for myself. So this is something I'm not, up here pointing and saying, oh, you mortals are doing this mistake, right? It's something that's happened to me many times, and I finally identified it. I finally put a name to it. But here's what happens. When you have a growth mindset, like I do, I have a very high one. A lot of the people we work with, they have high growth mindsets. I filter for this, right? Because who wants to work with somebody who always wants to be stuck, right? I can't fight that. When you're trying to help somebody heal from a complex chronic health condition, you need all the leverage you can get, right? It's a complex thing. So getting our own minds out of the way is very important. So anyway, I filter for people with a growth mindset. I have one. So this applies to me just as much as anybody else, right? And I'm teaching myself to do this over and over again and just always make sure I'm not getting stuck on accident. Because what happens when you have a growth mindset, especially when it's a relative strength of yours or high trait in your personality, is that you will enjoy the process of transition, of learning, of growth, right? You'll learn to enjoy that. A lot of times the opposite of that is when we can get anxiety around this, which I also have this too, where you're at the end of one point and there's a transition and there's the next point and you get so impatient, right? You just want that transition to be over with. You can't handle it, right? That gets in the way of the growth mindset a lot of times. So when you have a growth mindset, you're okay with that gap, with that big transition, right? It's okay, it's comfortable because you know that gap means growing, right? So you'll enjoy the gap. And in fact, when people have a really high growth mindset, they'll prolong the gap. They don't mind a longer transition, right? Because it's fueling part of their subconscious needs for feeling like they're growing. So what happens is a transition period, or basically another way to say transition is an unanswered question, right? The period where you have a question and it's unanswered and you're growing towards the answer. That's like, sugar for your subconscious that loves the feeling of growth. So the more unanswered questions you have hanging around, you have to wonder how many of them are actually relevant to get you where you want to go, and how many of them are actually just kind of on your mental wall because your subconscious loves having unanswered questions because it always feels like it's growing, right? You may have to be pretty vigilant with yourself with this. I do the same thing. And it's fun to have questions. You should have questions. And part of this is like, I'm handling frequently asked questions. I love the questions. It's important. And at the same time, we need to have this meta understanding of what's going on in the question asking process. And a lot of my job, as I see it, is to help people start asking the right questions in the first place, right? And sometimes what we do is we start with a question, and I've spoken about this in other videos, we start with a question that's not even the real question we should be asking, and we're asking the smaller version of it, right? And what that looks like, just to explain this, is, for example, the real question is probably, how do I get my life back from illness, right? Now the secondary question is, oh, how do I get these symptoms to go away, right? And then you may be getting further and further down and going, okay, well, I've got a disease diagnosis. How do I cure this disease or manage this disease, right? Whatever it is, Lyme, fibromyalgia, mold exposure, right? Whatever they kind of label you as, chronic fatigue syndrome, all these things. So you're moving from what actually matters on a day-to-day level that actually like touches your spirit, meaning you can't go live your life. You can't be spontaneous. You can't go plan on traveling and not being messed up. You can't be around certain people because interactions will just flatten you, right? There's a lot of things that happen that you're giving up. That's what actually matters for most people. And then we start getting more and more abstract, because guess what? That's a hard problem to solve, right? How do I get my life back? That's the real question. We're never deviating from that, right? Ever. But that's what happens. It's very hard. So instead of deviating, people tend to try to reduce the question. How do I get my life back? Gets reduced to, how do I suppress these symptoms? Gets reduced to some disease name, right? Especially some vague syndrome that's made up, right, by the medical establishment to try to explain symptom pictures and processes that they don't understand. Right? It's very frustrating for the patient. So how do you move from the real question? You go smaller and smaller and smaller, and then eventually you're just trying to solve some random thing, right? So a lot of the questions that I get, to be totally transparent here, a lot of the questions that I get, they're these branch tip questions, right? They're very, very specific, right? What do you think about methylene blue? What kind of binder should I use? Right? This kind of stuff. It's very, very specific technical questions, when really oftentimes we start zooming out and going, do we even need to be on that branch of thinking anyway? Are there bigger things we're missing? Is there a place where you can get more leverage on your body, on your whole system, so that you can actually start to get this stuff chipped away at a deeper level that's much closer to the actual question you want to answer, which is, how do I get my life back, right? So there's a lot of ways to kind of get lost in the weeds of all these, and that's what I want to do. That's my goal, is to help navigate that back up so that we can actually have like the whole system perspective and figure out what questions we should even be asking in the first place. The more abstract you get from your actual goal, the more watered down your results are going to be, right? I hope that makes sense. So what can happen with the growth mindset is that we can want to flesh out and grow all those branch tips of information, every single little detail. I've had people come into my solutions and support group, and what they really wanted to know was, how come their armpits and sweat smelled like onions, right? What does that have anything to do with getting your life back? But that's where this person was in terms of learning. She was way out on a wildly different branch, which I'm happy to answer that question. Actually, it was quite fun researching that and putting together the answer. But beyond the fun layer, there's a serious and deep misunderstanding of where she's pointing her attention, which is a limited resource, right? We only have so much attention. Where you point that, and what's going to give you the most leverage. So really, while it's possible that it doesn't matter about thiols and why your armpits smell like onions when you have a complex chronic health condition in some cases, right? She wants to know this really trivial detail. But it was kind of fun, looking it up and putting together an answer and synthesizing that with the other frameworks I already had about how this works, right? But it's also important to me to answer those questions, because I want the people in our world to know that even if you're on the wrong branch, I'll be out there with you too. I will go as far as you want to go on that until you're ready to turn around and try a different route. And that's okay. And that's part of my job, right? Is to go there too. So what we have with the growth mindset is typically this desire to keep staying on all these tips of branches, right? And that's one part of it, right? Because now you're feeding yourself growth, right? It's delicious, right? I'm growing. But you're growing in a very diluted way. You're growing with trivia, not with the actual question, right? It's like, oh, the question about why do my armpits stink? The real question is, how do you get your life back? How do you get your life back to the point where you're not having to research all these medical things about yourself in the first place, where you can be on vacation or doing whatever, right? Maybe you get back to work, or you're taking more clients, or whatever it is you're missing out on. You can be doing that instead of looking up health information all the time. So that's where we try to get you, not about why do your armpits smell, right? So what can happen is when we shift that question, which is part of my job, right, to have this perspective. I've been doing this a good while, I'm still learning all the time, but I share the perspectives I have, especially with our prospective clients, right? People who are coming into our group and they're kind of checking out this approach and what's the culture like and all that. And of course, if you come into our group as a guest, you're allowed to ask me anything you want, right? And it's really interesting because when people come into our world, it's like they could be coming from any kind of environment with all kinds of misconceptions, right? Or a lot of medical baggage, right? And almost like a history of neglect, and mild abuse from the medical establishment or from their family in general. Who knows what people have been through, right? So we have to be compassionate to that when they come in. And that's part of my job, is to not try to shut that down. Hey, your question doesn't matter, right? Here's this. I'm a little softer. I want to handle that question. And let's take another look at something over here where you may not have to ask that question in the first place. And this is another trap for the growth mindset, right? Because if we start, hey, you took away my small question and now we're going to a bigger thing, and I could actually focus my intent and my energy here for a little while, I might actually solve this, right? And while that sounds good and that's the goal, unfortunately, if we have a really high growth mindset, this is the double-edged sword of it, is that a solved problem is done. There's no more growth to extract from there. This is a big source of self-sabotage, right? This is one reason why, and I know this, when we're out on some branch about some trivial question and I steer it back to the real question you should be asking and why you came here in the first place, including the question all of the people I work with that are highly successful and get their lives back and overcome complex chronic health condition, they learn to ask this question fearlessly, is how do I get my life back, right? And no matter how far out on a branch we go, we never forget where we came from. How do I get my life back? Or whatever your verbiage is, right? Whatever your equivalent phrase is. How do I participate in life again, right? How do I get my vitality back? There's lots of ways people phrase it, but that's the real question, right? How do you get back connected to your life? So if I try to steer the conversation, right, and I meet resistance, what's that telling me, right? How do we learn about the people that we're helping, right? We pay attention to their behaviors and their subconscious and what's the mindset going on there. This is one of like 10,000 things that I'm constantly paying attention to with everybody I come into contact with. But it's important, right? Because that's how I learn. That's how I know who can handle the climb and who can't. So the resistance of, I don't want to look at this trivial detail, right? I don't want to be zoomed off of that and into something that could actually make a big change for me. I don't want to do that, right? Why? Friendly, I'll ask, right? Why? It can be triggering. People don't know why they do a lot of things. But if you come in with a growth mindset, then that's the other paradox, right? You can't have your cake and eat it. You got to be ready to explore these kinds of things because you need to grow internally too, which means asking questions of yourself as well. I told you there's a deep paradox here. So when I feel that resistance, it's most likely a growth mindset who doesn't actually want the problem to be solved, because an unsolved problem, an unanswered question, that all feeds growth. Right? So you're choosing growth in a pathological way, right? Instead of growing into yourself and into your life, being able to grow that way, right? To grow out into the world, you're choosing to continue to grow in circles around the same problem, right? Because there's something that someone's pointing out that should have been obvious, right? But it takes a certain perspective and then a certain willingness, openness to look. So these are the kinds of conversations we're having in our solutions and support group. And I would encourage you, if you would like to apply for that, you'll find the link. And we have, again, I've mentioned in this video, it's free to be a guest here. I do have programs, my long-term clients, I'm not cheap to work with, right, of course, but that's a factor of how I value my approach, right? How I value my attention, how I value my energy. So, if that's something you're thinking about, the best thing to do is to just come into the group for free. Ask me anything you want. I'm very happy to share my perspective. And what's really great is we've got our own private chat group, so it's not like a big tech platform. So your response from me is going to be completely open and free, and I'm not worried about getting censored or anything like that in there. So it's a great place to ask me anything. We've got an interactive vault full of videos that'll help you get sorted out in terms of where you are in your healing process, right? There's like 4 stages, at least for most people. You got to know where you are so you know where you're headed. So we work on that within the group, and it's just a lovely place to be. Lots of positivity. So if I see your application, I'll let you know just as soon as possible if you made it, and maybe I'll see you in the group. All right, let's get you feeling better. Cheers.